We've been talking about what God cannot do. Really, it's just as I've said so many times in the series, it's a negative way of looking at the positive of God. But it reminds us of certain things. Tonight, we want to talk about a lesson entitled, God Cannot Allow You to Enter Irresistible Temptation. Turn your Bible to 1 Corinthians 10:13. You probably know the verse well from the standpoint of repeating. But that's where I want us to pretty much be tonight. I kind of changed my thought with regards to exactly how I wanted to do this. So if I revert and you say, well, they chased a lot of rabbits tonight, bear with me. I'll try to bring it off to a reasonable and understandable conclusion. When we think about temptation is defined, the English word is defined as enticement to act in disobedience to God's will. And that's pretty much it. You look it up in Greek, it's just temptation. Seduction. We know that James tells us in James 1 verse 14 that Satan is a subtle worker, working really on our own selfishness to get us to do his will, to do his bidding. We know that temptation is real. We know that temptation is there. Always has been and always will be. It was there in the Garden of Eden. It was there. You stop thinking about how successful Satan was. And about, best we can tell, about 1,500 years later, Genesis chapter 6, Noah's building an ark. The reason he's building an ark is because man's already disgusted God. He said, I'm just going to destroy the world. But he's going to save, of course, Noah, and he's going to save his family, and he does. We're going to just start all over. And then you go to Genesis, and you don't have to flip really many pages, but you get to Genesis chapter 10, the pride of man, Tower of Babel, and the fact that man has come to his own way of thinking. And we go through, you can go through Sodom and Gomorrah, you can go through it all, book of just Genesis. And you say, wow, there's a lot of temptation, a lot of folks that gave in to temptation. And that's true. And it always has been, and it always will be. That Satan is, as Peter said, he's a roaring what? 1 Peter 5 verse 8. Lion. Walks about seeking whom he may devour. It's interesting because the word lion there really, in a Greek sense, goes back not to a lion as we think of a lion, but to a hyena, which they say is worse than a lion. And he's a scavenger. And so when you think about what Peter is saying, he's saying Satan's terrible, but he's walking about, which would imply the idea of stalking. He's not just running around haphazardly. And I've talked about, you've heard it several times, in Ephesians 6, where he talks about the wiles of the devil. The word wiles there means a planned system of attack. Temptation is real. And when it comes, and it hits hard. God cannot allow us to be tempted to the point where that's all we can do is give in. And the reason he can't is because of several reasons, but most notably is the statement of fact that Paul gave by inspiration in 1 Corinthians 10. Like I say, this is a verse that you could probably, most if not all of you, could quote. Paul has been talking about in the chapter itself, beginning in verse 1, he's been talking about Old Testament examples, trying to call the children of, trying to call the church of Corinth into a act of repentance, I guess is for lack of a better term, to following God, to return back to God, do what God has said. And so one of the things he does here is he calls into account the Old Testament and the example of the children of Israel and how they had turned from God. They had turned especially to idols verse 7 talks about how that they had turned to idols. And they had turned to all kinds of this special sexual immorality, which is really what Paul was addressing in 1 Corinthians. And he says, these things, verse 11, happen to them as examples, and they are written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. Therefore, let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. Paul admonishes the church at Corinth to be careful, watch out, don't let your pride get the best of you. Understand that temptation comes, but you don't have to give in. And so then the reassuring verse, and the verse that helps us so much, is verse 13. No temptation has overtaken you, except such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will also make a way of escape, that you may be able to bear it. Well, there's a lot in there to unpack, if you will, in that verse. There's first of all the idea of company. Look what he says. No temptation has overtaken you, such as is common to man. Whatever you've gone through, or whatever you're going through, whatever temptation you face, others have. And if they haven't, they will. Now, you might say, well, I've got some temptations that folks haven't been touched with. I ran across a while back a list. Let me give you just some food for thought, and we won't get into all these verses, but I'm going to give you verses just to show you that if you've got some of these, guess what? It's not you. Discontent. Luke chapter 3, verse 14. Jesus told souls there to be content with their wages. Pride. Romans 1:22. Fear. Jonah. Worry. Luke 10, verse 41. Time. Matthew 25, 1 through 12. Galatians 3:5. Fornication. 1 Corinthians. Homosexuality. Romans chapter 1. Alcoholism. 1 Corinthians 6. On and on and on and on and on. You go. Solomon probably said it best in the book of Ecclesiastes. Remember what he said? There's nothing new under the what? Sun. Yeah. There's nothing new under the sun. And that's sad to say, and we like to think that we are advanced, and we are. But yet the same things keep coming up. Paul says you need to know something, which you've gone through, others have. And you've often heard me talk about Satan's used his devices, if you will. He uses tools, he uses tricks, and he uses features. But that's the way he uses or operates. That he uses the devices. In 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 11, remember what Paul says? We are not ignorant of his devices, his tricks, his ploys. We find out as well in Ephesians 6 and 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 22. And then, of course, teachers. I mean, go through really all the New Testament. Go through the book of, I was going through the book of Jude here a few weeks ago. And Jude talks about the false teachers that were there. And so Satan uses those to trick man, to test man, to put him, if you will, at a disadvantage, so that in being tempted, he thinks, well, that's all I can do is do what I think I should do, or I want to do. Paul says you need to know something. Your temptation is not new, it's not different. There's nothing new under the sun. But then he makes a statement, and the statement is powerful as well. The statement is that God is faithful. That's reassuring. Because in the midst of temptation, here's what we wonder, excuse me, wonder, where is God? In other words, where is God? I mean, in some ways you could imply that while Jesus was hanging on the cross, right? My God, why, what? Have you forsaken me? Where are you? What has happened to you? Why have you left me? But the Bible says that God's not a fair weather God. Look what he says. He says, God is faithful. He sticks around. The story of the prodigal son in Luke 15 is a great example of this. You stop to think about it. The son left the father. When the son came to himself and he needed to go back to the father, where did he go? Home. Why? Because that's where the father was. Father had left. Father had moved out. Father was still there. He knew where to go, and he knew to go back because he knew where the Father was. God is faithful. He doesn't run out on us. Oh, I've got a long list here. I'm sure if you're not writing them down, but you can go jump to something that you know right very well. Joshua 1, verse 9, Psalm 121, the whole psalm there, Isaiah 41:10. Just to name a few, that talk about God is the constant. I like Psalm 18, which is also found in 2 Samuel 22, where it says God's our rock, our fortress, and our deliverer. If you've ever been to Stone Mountain right outside of Atlanta, Georgia, you know the huge stone that's come out of the earth, so to speak, right there. And you've seen the carvings. And if you've been there at night, you've seen the laser display and the fireworks at special times. And it's a tremendous thing. Suzanne and I have been there a couple of different times to see. And when I think of when David says, Lord's my rock, that's the rock I think of. And if you come to my house right now, you can see some large rocks. And you can see some larger rocks that they dug out of my yard, but some large rocks that they're using that they've gotten from the quarry over here. And they've laid in certain places they're using. But you can pick those up and you can move them. But when the psalmist says God's my rock, he's talking about one that you cannot move. He's faithful. In the midst of our trials, in the midst of our temptations, we wonder, where's God? And the reality of it is God's where he's always been. He hasn't left, he hasn't moved, he's faithful. Go back to 1 Corinthians 10, verse 13. Who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able. Now there's some food for thought. And that also can cause us some questions when you stop and think about it. Let's look at what he says. He says, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able. Who will not allow? The idea of permit, allow. God permits, God allows temptation. And he says, what you are able. It's the idea of what you are able to bear. Now, I want us to do something. Put your finger there, but it's going to be a while before we get back there. I want you to see a parallel. Look at Job 1. Now, keep your finger, like say, 1 Corinthians 10:13. We'll come back to there. But it's going to be a while, because I want us to look at Job 1 for a few minutes. In Job 1, beginning in verse 1, it says, there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. And that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and shunned evil. This is a righteous man. I don't mean arrogant, I mean righteous but humble. This is a man that is truly, if we were to characterize him in our day and age with our vernacular, we would say this is a good Christian man. He's a good man. He has 7 sons, 3 daughters that were born to him in verse 2. He has possessions. Notice what he has. Also his possessions were 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, a very large household, so that this man was the greatest of all the people of the East. He had a great deal of wealth. He had the blessings with regards to children. He had wealth with regards to what he owned, because remember, they didn't have banks, they didn't have financial institutions then, and so wealth was basically judged by what you had. And he had sheep, he had camels, he had oxen, he had donkeys. He also had servants, he had a large household, he had servants. And it talks about then how that his family seemingly was a good family. They would go, the sons would go, and they would feast in their house. On appointed days, they would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. They would have parties. They would have family parties. So when the days of the feasting had run their course, Job would send and sanctify them. He would rise early in the mornings and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. Job said, "It may be that my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." Thus Job did regularly. So Job sowed seed with family. Because remember, Job is believed to have been in the patriarchal age and not in the Mosaical age. So thus the father would take care of, evidently at that time, sacrifices for the family. And then it said, beginning in verse 6, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord. Probably the sons of men, or sons of God, excuse me, probably angelic hosts. And Satan also came. And the Lord said to Satan, "From where do you come?" So Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking back and forth on it." Carries us back to a verse we looked at a while ago, 1 Peter 5. He's the roaring lion, walking about, stalking, seeking whom he may desire, devour. Job account, Satan said, "Well, Lord, I've just been walking to and fro back throughout the earth." And the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered? Have you given thought to it? Have you thought about it? Have you one way of saying it, have you set your heart on? But have you thought about my servant Job, that there's none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, one who fears God and shuns evil, who turns away from evil, doesn't want to have any part to do with evil." We characterized him in verse 1. Satan answered, verse 9, "Does Job fear God for nothing?" Now here's the accusation that Satan has made. Job's so good. Why does he have respect for you? It almost entails the idea of Job is earning his salvation by being such a good guy, that he really has no reason to do anything with you. That's, of course, the question of Satan. And he goes on. He says, "Have you not made a hedge around him, around his household, and around all that he has on every side? You've blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. Now, stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will surely curse you to your face." Satan, not just persistent, but arrogant. See, God, you protected this old boy. Well, we said in invitation, one of the assurances of the Old Testament and New Testament as well is the protection of God for his saints. And Satan, that's what Satan says. You have set a hedge around him, this idea of a fence. You've set a fence around him so that nobody can touch him. And he says, look here, he says, I guarantee you that we take some of this away and he'll give up. The Lord said, verse 12, behold, all that he has is in your power. Only do not lay a hand on his person. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. And I'm going to read all this, but we'll take the time to read all of it. But think about it. Go look through there. Verse 13, now there was a day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. And a messenger came to Job and said, the oxen were plowing, the donkeys feeding beside them, when the Sabaeans raided them and took them away. Indeed, they've killed the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone escaped death. Now, Job's going to get word in the rest of this chapter. Job's going to get word that basically he's lost everything. He's lost his kids. He's lost his servants. He's lost his livestock. So he's lost his family, and he's lost his wealth. He's lost everything that would physically be dear to him. In verse 18, while he was still speaking, another also came. Their sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. Suddenly a great wind came across the wilderness, struck the four corners of the house. It fell on the young people that are dead, and I alone escaped to tell you. Notice Job's reaction. Job arose, tore his robe, shaved his head, fell to the ground. This is the standard reaction, brief reaction to those folks that live these. We don't do that like that. I mean, we still grieve, and that's fine. This grief is fine. But this was the standard way. You tear your robe, that's a sign of grief, a sign of remorse. You shave your head, and once again, a sign of grief, and he falls to the ground and worships. And this next verse is familiar to us all. Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord saved away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. It's all gone. I don't have anything. And he said, yet, verse 2 says, and all this Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. I don't know how much it would take. And I can't answer that, and everybody's different. I spent a lot of time counseling a lady. A lot of time. Good lady. That when she and her husband got married, they had been married for a little while, and she got pregnant. And they had twins. And the twins died in the hospital. She couldn't get pregnant again. She had complications. They eventually adopted a dog. Oh, he was the star of their life. Father one day going to work, pulled out in front of the vehicle and was killed. The boy was probably, at that time, an adopted son would have been, about 11, maybe 12, more than that. He presented some troubles for her. Here she is by herself. Twins died many years before, but her husband said this young boy she loves, he presented many problems. Not so much with the law, but just a lot of emotional problems, a lot of other problems. And she really felt wrung out. At 19 years of age, he was going to vocational school, and he was going to school one day. A police officer who had been up for 24 hours, went to sleep at the wheel, went across the road and ran smack dab right head on to this young boy and killed him. She's left by herself now. She has a sister. She has two nephews. There's a brother-in-law. That's it. Her mother is dead. Her dad died years ago, but she brought her mother in with her eventually, and then her mother was of age, died. That's a lot to bear. That's a lot to go through in a lifetime. She handled it fairly well, with a lot of help from a lot of people. And you wonder sometimes about her, and you wonder about old Job, how much he can take. Let's keep reading. Let's go down to Job chapter 2. Again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also with them to present himself before the Lord. And the Lord said to Satan, "Where do you come?" Satan answered the Lord and said, "Going to and fro on the earth, and from walking back and forth on it," much the same as we had in chapter 1. The Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? If there's none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, one who fears God and shuns evil, and still he holds fast to his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him without cause." So Satan answered the Lord and said, "Skin for skin, yes, all that a man has, he will give for his life. Stretch out your hand now, touch his bone and his flesh, and he'll surely curse you to your face." In other words, let me touch him. Let me do something to him. So the Lord said to Satan, verse 6, "Behold, he's in your hand to spare his life." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and struck Job with painful blows from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. And he took for himself a potsherd, which is the equivalent of that is really, you've probably all seen, I can bring you one, clay pot that's broken. It's got jagged edges, and you just scrape yourself with it. I mean, just itch that bad. From the sole of his foot and crown, and took a potsherd, which he scraped himself while he sat in the midst of the ashes. And his wife said to him, "Do you still hold fast to your integrity? Curse God and die." But he said to her, "You speak as one of the foolish women speaks. Shall we indeed accept good from God, and shall we not accept adversity? In all this, Job did not sin with his lips." I love that story, and I guess I love that story because I do refer to it from time to time in sermons. I love the ending of the story because Job's three friends come, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. They come and they keep accusing Job and keep throwing up the reason that he had problems is because of sin in his life. And you go through these cycles of speech where one of the friends would give a speech and then Job would answer him, and then the next friend would give a speech and Job would answer him. And so they have 3 cycles of speeches. Each one had 3 opportunities to speak. And then all Job keeps saying is, "You're wrong. That's not right. I don't want to talk to God." And then Elihu comes. And Elihu is a younger guy. Elihu is it's almost like if Job is, say, if he's got grown children, let's just say, we have no idea, but let's just say Job is in his 50s, maybe 60s, let's just say, we're just kind of picking ages arbitrarily, but Job's in his 60s. Well, Elihu comes and he's a 20-year-old. He's fresh out of school, wet behind the ears, and he says, "I got the answers." And if you listen to him, if you read what he says virtually the same thing that Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar have said. Not exactly, but it's close. And Job said, no, you're wrong. Let me talk to God. And there's a great discussion there as God appears in a whirlwind. Job talks to Job. And there's a great discussion there. Of course, we find the power of God, the understanding of suffering, and the fact that if you look at it, Job is blessed many times over. He has more at the end of Job than he had at the beginning of Job. Doesn't replace what he had from the standpoint of his feelings for his children, his family, but it's still, he has more than what he had to begin with. It is not so much Job 3 through chapter 4:2 that I'm interested in for tonight, but it is the first couple of chapters of Job. Because one of the things that is said by Job is when we receive a little bad and he credits it to God, he says, aren't we supposed to take that too? And if we go through and look at the two times Satan and God speak to each other, their conversations, very short, but there is that point in which God allows Satan to test Job. And so we look at it and we say, well, how can that be? And why would that be? And how can God do that? Now, go back to 1 Corinthians 10. Go back to that phrase that we were last on. Who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able. The old King James says this puts your able back. I like that because I think it finishes the thought. I think the New King James is probably closer to the original text, but I like what the old King James says because it helps me with my understanding. God allows temptation, permits temptation. We don't understand that. Now, it's not that God does the tempting. It's the fact that God permits Satan to do the work. And we might ask the question, well, why? We might ask the question, well, then is temptation not from God? But James 1 tells us what? That no man say when he is tempted, I am tempted of what? God, the Lord, depending among the person you're using. And so, ultimately, temptation doesn't come from God. But now, when you stop and look at the Bible, and we don't have time, this is not the purpose, but go through and look at the catastrophes that happen in life that are often accredited to God, that really weren't God's doing. God allowed them. Well, some would say, I don't see that. I don't see how God can do that. God allows temptation because he wants to see where man is. He wants to try man. He wants to test him from the standpoint of allowing him to be tested by Satan. He really wants followers who really want to follow him. Maybe to best understand it is in John 6. If you think back and go back and read John 6 this week, but if you think about John 6, there are those that were following Jesus. And Jesus really laid down a difficulty. And the difficulty was, he says, except you eat my flesh and drink my blood. And we've talked about those verses before. They're not the Lord's Supper. It's not an institution of the Lord's Supper. Jesus is laying down, he says, unless you're really willing to be committed to it, he says, you're not, you can't be of me. And it says in John 6 that many went away, and that's when Peter was asked. He said, well, you also going to go away. He said, Lord, where shall we go? For you have the words of life. In other words, where else can we go to really get what we need? But there were all those that went away. Jesus is really, I think that story is a practical application to what's going on here. Jesus is putting people to the test to see who really was following and who was just following him for the show or for the food or for the just, it was the end thing to be doing. So Jesus is saying, I really want you committed to me. So God allows us, we could look at a lot of other passages, not the purpose, but God allows temptation. But here's the point. God never allows us to be tempted above what we're able to bear. Think about what Job lost. And yet Job stood under the test of fire and was able to stand and glow in a very positive way. Because God knew that he could bear it. Now, go back to our text. It's run out of time. And there's a lot more to that. And I realize that, and probably we should have spent more time on it, and I'll be glad to answer questions. But he says in our text in 1 Corinthians 10:13, but with the temptation will also make the way of escape, that you may be able to bear it. There's always a way out. There's always an escape hatch. There's always a way out of the temptation. The temptation is great. But while the temptation is great, God always provides a way out, and it's up to us to take it. We don't have to take it, and a lot of folks don't take it, but it's always there. And so we're reminded that in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 13, that God cannot allow us to be tempted to a point in which all we can do is give in. He allows us to be tempted. But in allowing us to be tempted, He makes sure that we understand there's a way of escape. There's conquering. God knows how to deliver His children. He always has. He always will. Look in, I tell you what, let's look at what happens. 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 9. 2 Peter 2, verse 9. Peter makes that statement. He says, the Lord knows how to deliver the godly out of temptation and to reserve the unjust under punishment for the day of judgment. The Lord knows how to deliver. It's interesting when you go back and look at 1 Timothy chapter 6. Timothy is talking there about the good soldier. And he says, really, there's three options. Flee, follow, or fight. Which one are you going to do? You're going to flee. You're going to flee temptation. You're going to follow the Lord and fight for the Lord, or not? Well, Peter says the Lord's going to provide a way of escape. What's our way of escape? Well, we could look at this. Bible study, Psalm 119, verse 11, hide the word of God in your heart. Prayer, Matthew 6, 1 Thessalonians 5, Philippians 4, all the standards. Self-examination is important. 2 Corinthians 13, verse 5, Deuteronomy 11, verse 16. Cultivating a reverential fear for God. In other words, not afraid of God, but willing to reverence Him to the point of elevating Him to be the one that's important. And when we do those things, then we're able to withstand temptation, knowing the way of escape is there. Now, will we always take it? No. But like we used last Wednesday night, I know we used it last Wednesday night, but I believe we used it a week ago this past Sunday. Deuteronomy chapter 30, where Moses sets before the people the choice. Set before you good and evil. Which one are you going to choose? He says, he kind of pulls out the old Joshua trick. He says, in my house, we're going to choose good. And so, in our temptation, let us understand we'll be tempted. Jesus was tempted. Adam was tempted. Jesus was tempted. Go through. Jeremiah was a good man. He was tempted. David, he had his ups and downs, but he was a fairly good man. He was tempted. Peter was tempted. So forth and so on. Some gave in, some did not, at least in the stories that were given. God always provided a way of escape for them. Just today. Anything else? I ain't got a phone, so I'll shut up. Anything anybody wants to say or ask?
What's his Job's way of escape?
I'm sorry, what?
What was Job's way of escape?
I don't know, that's what the text doesn't tell me, but evidently it was there, or evidently he didn't need it. It's an excellent question, you don't have text.
The answer is submission. He did pretty good submit to it.
He submitted to God.
Submitted.
Or like James. Happy, count joy if you fall into temptations and problems. You know, the attitude you have is what gets you through it, you know. You don't get mad at God the first time something happens. Or kind of that joy that you get. I don't know how it can come out, but I do have somebody on my side.
Right.
How did Job know that God was on his side? When God is the reason that he was in that position.
Which is true of all of us, isn't it? I think it like this. I think we have to understand that what it gets down to is two things. Preparation beforehand. And a worldview that's different than the world's view. A worldview, by definition, by way I'm using the term worldview, is the idea of what do you look towards? How do you see things? Politically, and maybe we understand it better this way, politically, we're either conservative or we're liberal. And you might say, well, I'm a moderate. Well, you're a moderate in your eyes, but you're probably a liberal in somebody's eyes, and you're a conservative in somebody else's eyes. I mean, it's the pendulum thing. So whether you're a Democrat, Republican, or Libertarian, or whatever you are, you're either conservative or you're liberal. And within the confines of whatever pigeonhole you fall in, is how you view the news that comes on at night. How you view what you see in the world by your worldview. As Christians, our worldview is faith in God. And so while we see the problems and we see the difficulties and we see the things that go on, we see our temptation, we can allow it to do one of two things: pull us away from God or pull us towards God. I would say the example that I gave you a while ago of the lady that lost the twins and lost the teenage boy and the husband. She really let her faith in God be strengthened. She teaches, when it comes her time, she teaches ladies Bible class. I had a lot of conversations with her, and sometimes I was built up and informed on my faith based on the faith she had. It's because of the prism, the worldview, but the prism that she looked through. And so I'm not sure that we always see our way out. But I think we can take the assurance that it's there. Knowing, James 1, that the trying of our faith does produce patience. It will let it. That's where I stand. Any questions?
One of the most interesting things about the book of Job is Job never knows why he went through all
No,
this.
that's right.
God never tells him, talks to him, tells him everything else, but he never said, no, Job, this is why this happened to you.
Right. Right. Exactly right.
His friends told him why it was happening to him. That's how he already knew.
Yeah, but they were wrong.
I mean, that's probably the book that I have read the most times. You can read it almost like a little novel. Just sit down and read it and think about it. And I really, for sure, it's the one I've read the most, and I've always been really fascinated.
Yeah, great book.
And I love at the end when God said, "You're not going to ask me questions. I'll ask you some questions. We'll see how much you know." Job says, "And I don't know nothing.
Right.
Just here."
Yeah. Yeah.
By the grace of God.
Yeah. Yeah.
Who put him in that situation in the first place.
To test him, to polish him, according to what Peter would write in 2 Peter 1.
Put Satan in his place.
God being arrogant on this, on account of Job. Hey, look at him. Look what I got right here.
I think you can interpret it that way. I mean, you could, I don't, but you could, I see that. What did I say, Peter? I say, Peter, what is it? Anyway, read First, Second Peter, it's in. Brother Keeper would say, oh, anything else?
Read before that it is one of the most like literary books, like it really is written like a work of literature. It's just all there, the whole story's there, you don't need that much outside, and a lot of references, you can just, yeah, there's so much just from that story.
It, had been called a theodicy, or not a theodicy, but well, there's a technical term for it, but basically a play. And some have said that it is a play that's not inspired. I think it is inspired. It could have been. It could have been. I'm not saying it is. I haven't done enough study on this, but it could have been the very first book chronologically of the Bible written. And there are a lot of folks that place Job in the time of Adam. I'm not saying that's true, because I haven't studied that enough to say, this is my feelings on it. My feelings on it is it's inspired. I if you know about background, when I got out of Freed-Hardeman, I was living in Washington State. There was three of the guys, Lance Porter, Mike Nelson, and Dan Winkler, that had already started graduate school up here, and they looked at them and going one day a week. So anyway, I went. Well, my time ran out. I didn't even finish. My time ran out. I went back to Freed-Hardeman many years later, and finished my master's degree at Freed-Hardeman. But anyway, I say that to say this: I took Job at David Lipscomb, and I took Job at Freed-Hardeman, and so I've had it twice, and it's just a magnificent book to study. Anything else?
I have a question. This place that these friends of Job came from, they've actually come to the control page. Names,
Yeah.
yeah. Or something like that, maybe,
Early days, yes.
Yes.
Anything else? These women are coming out. Let's bow forward and pray. Our Father in heaven, we're thankful for this day, thankful for the opportunity that we have to study your word. We're thankful for what it means to us, for the fact that we do know and understand that we will be tried, but even in our trials and temptations, that you're there, you're a faithful God, you're there with us. Not only are you there with us, but you also will provide a way of escape. Help us to always stand strong. Help us to always live with you and for you, to hold you as you hold to us. This is our prayer in Christ's name. And may you so rest us. Y'all have a great night.